great example, the artificial intelligence that you use to help some English learners.
Oh, with the
Or maybe that was Tiffany's idea, I'm not sure.
signs so they can.
And how did you, just tell that quickly.
Like how you create.
How'd you get them?
Sure. Well, I will tell you, that was where AI came into fruition, is basically we said we need to know like bathroom, hello in English and translate it into Ukrainian or Spanish. And so we were able to do that and put some signs up around so kids were able to access their building.
And hopefully they could read.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because if they couldn't read, that might have been just funny.
Absolutely.
There's
There's
pictures.
pictures as
There's
well.
pictures, and we
Yeah.
had
Pictures,
lanyards
too.
that have
Yep.
pictures, and so that we're trying to. And there's a component too to just when we have a student's native language visible in the building, it makes them feel welcome. It's saying, hey, you're a part of what we're doing, and you're part of our community, and we value your presence here. And so it's been a pretty cool experience to welcome those kids to our school.
We do still have, I would say, some significant work to do to support our English learners. And as we see increasing numbers of newcomers, so kids coming to our district with no English, and we see an increase of what we call SLIFE students. So that's students with limited or interrupted formal education. So to your point, we would have students that are not necessarily educated in their native country as well. And so that is presenting a huge challenge, and it's one that we have a small group that is really very diligently looking at how do we specifically support our EL students, because there's a lot of layers to doing that. Even for that classroom teacher, one of the things we are talking about is we do newcomer kits for families and their students. We actually are talking about doing a newcomer kit for the classroom teacher, right? So that they feel somewhat empowered. We are working with the state of Michigan. We're piloting a free resource that would allow a differentiated, interactive software for, and it's meant just to supplement. It's certainly not meant to replace direct instruction. So it's a really valid question. It's one that is not easily answered. And it's one that I think we recognize will take some time and energy.
I'll kind of let the wrap up on this one, but to give you an idea, all those things we're trying to do with about $73,000 is what we get
Correct.
Wow. 27.
for the whole district.
28 languages and about $73,000 is the amount of funding.
You
that
need
would-
blue phones for all the kids.
Mhm.
RIT, what is that? It's an acronym.
RTI or RIT?
RIT.
RIT.
Oh, the
okay.
RIT score?
score.
RIT.
Yeah, that's the scaled score for the NWEA assessment. And so each student gets a score that falls on a broad continuum.
Okay.
And I can't remember the guy's name, but it's an interval named after a guy. And it just allows us to kind of norm the kids, how the students perform both within our district and compared to the nation.
The great thing about NWEA and that RIT score is it's comparable across grade levels. So a second grader who has a RIT of 205 and a third grader who has a RIT of 205 are essentially performing
Comparable.
at the same level.
It-
So NWEA is adaptive, so it's not very specific to this is third grade standards and this is what it's testing. It tests a multitude, and then it helps us to really know where they are applying the skills they're learning in curriculum to actual instruction. Like assessment.
So are they at the same level as, the same number if you're in third grade as if you were a second grader at that? Okay.
Correct.
So it's not that each grade proportionally has their own score.
Yep, exactly.
Little clarity
And
there.
that's helpful when we're doing these data meetings, because we have had students that would join a group that's at a different grade level to either challenge or to support their level of need that may not match with other kids at that grade level.
And those, I think, to also add a little clarity to the data that we'll see eventually too, is that RIT score, we've discovered about the 60th percentile. So a kid that scores in the 60th percentile on the NWA predicts pretty favorably to them being proficient on M-STEP. So we typically use that 60th percentile score. So a third grader scoring in the 60th percentile, we would say they're pretty likely to be on track to be proficient. So that kind of factors in that where they are, how they stack up to the actual grade level as well.
Okay.
Can I comment really quick for you too? Because I had that same question a couple of years ago and I looked it up. It means rash unit.
There it is.
Rash unit.
Yes, I had to
That
relook it
sounds
up.
like a
So I didn't
disease.
retain it. I had to look it up just to qualify.
Rash
But
unit.
I had this, because I'm so literal, I had to look it up too.
So you can think of it as a RIT score of 205, if you are in second grade, might put you in the 90th percentile. And if you're in fourth grade, it would put you in the 15th percentile, right? So the percentile is what they're looking at to determine how a kid is progressing through their grade levels. But the RIT score, in essence, is saying this is
Where they
the
are
score.
on the overall.
Yes.
Okay, and then can I very briefly go back to when you do your interventional things? I kind of was getting confused when you were taking this one out and putting that one there, and I was kind of not knowing where in the Sam Hill anybody was. And so, yeah, so you have a group of kids, and you have some kids that you say need intervention. Do you pull them out of the classroom, they go someplace entirely with other kids that come in, and then they have their own little group of catch-up remedial work?
Yep, we have common intervention times in our building, so there's second grade intervention time or switch time. And so that's when they move to those different groups. So my interventionist may take 5 kids from the 2 classes that are at that grade level. The aide takes 5 kids, and then the rest of the kids mix up and go to the classroom teachers within that grade level. And each staff member is teaching something different that is to the group's needs within that.
Okay, and so can the kids be missing something while they're out, and so they're getting further behind compared to?
That's why we do that common intervention time, so that it's what everybody needs, whether it is pushing you to a higher level or whether it's remediation at that common time. So yes, during that time, they're not
Okay.
missing anything that's core instruction.
One other question, what happens if a kid is out, say, a couple of weeks, bad case of measles, something like that? They come back in, they're behind, and they may be off of your regular interventional idea. How do they get remedial catch-up?
Yeah. Absences affect a lot throughout the day, and it's not just intervention that they're missing all the content areas which build those gaps that we see. I think, this intervention time is a way to catch up. They're not regrouped after they come back, but we do look at data several times during the school year to reshuffle kids based on need. And so we would reshuffle if there's a bigger hole.
Because bad head lice, taking a kid out for 10 days, could actually, in this kid trying to come back into a math class, they're out and behind for the rest of the grade.
But per
How do they catch
but per
up?
our pertussis policy, you don't miss school if you have head lice.
Correct.
True story.
Yeah, you do.
No,
No.
Oh, yes, you
not
do.
not with our school board policy.
Well, not with our policy, but yes, you do, for real life.
I've got a quick question. The score handout from Long Lake and Blair, are these the same students?
The data that you see for behavior is our entire buildings. So not just, they're included in that.
That's what I
it is the
thought.
entire school population.
It would be interesting to see. Okay.
Yeah.
I've got a kind of a related question to the grouping. It does appear that the NWA test is pretty predictive as far as, because you said you bring in some other, more subjective, how they're doing just outside of this 1 or
Data
2 day
points.
test. It does look like the test is pretty predictive to kind of that other peripheral stuff that you're bringing into this equation to group the students when they need different levels of teaching. I mean, is that pretty normal? I mean, or do you see every once in a while where, you know, maybe they are progressing like we expect them to. They're just not good at the NWEA.
Absolutely, we see that, and that's why we like to introduce those additional data points, and that goes both ways.
Right.
Sometimes you'll have us that scores pretty high on NWA, and then you look at the other more discrete assessments, and we see there's actually a problem that we missed in that broader assessment, and we do see the flip side of that too,
Yeah.
that you described, where yeah, they just can be pretty anxious. Like
Yeah.
it can feel high stakes for kids, and sometimes we forget they're 7 and 8. You know, that has an impact. So we try to take that into account as well.
It's nice that we use different types of data sets to look at, because NWEA is pretty broad, and we'll have a student that does really well on NWEA but doesn't even know all their letters and sounds, and so they can apply those, like they can hear a story and retell it, but they can't read, and so it helps us to prevent just glossing over them and saying they did great on NWEA and finding out 2 years later that they have some real gaps and holes.
And how often are those? Are you assessing those throughout the school year?
In NWEA,
No,
or
I
the
mean,
more
like just
progress monitoring.
yeah.
Yeah.
The Ames Web one and the math screener we use both kind of line up in about the same time frame as the NWEA. But each student then that is in intervention, we progress monitor on a weekly basis to gauge the progress along the way. So, and I can say, like at my building, we've added in additional data checks in December and March to kind of, we want to make sure that kids are not falling behind, or the interventions not having an impact. So some of that is site dependent, based on kind of the resources you have available in order to pull that off.
There was one slide that had a bunch of little dots and lines that went back and forth and back and forth. That's the progress monitoring right there. That's the progress monitoring from Ames Web, and those are like every 2-week checks. And we want to make sure that the trend line is going up and not down. And sometimes it does go down, and then we're like, okay, this intervention is not a good fit for that student, so we want to switch. And intervention time is one factor of their whole day, but we're trying to align their needs specifically to that intervention.
So it is phased. Those kids that you see in those intervention groups are getting progress monitored either weekly or every other week. The kids that you see that are in the classroom, the larger classroom, those are students that are getting progress monitored either at a monthly basis or simply 3 times a year, because we don't have any reason to have to progress monitor them more than that. Are we ready? Do we have a couple more building level questions?
I have one more.
Yes.
more
Go ahead.
question.
And I guess I just rely on you guys to.
Yeah, keep us on
If
time.
you need to move us forward,
Yeah.
then you
Yeah.
can be aggressive on it.
Okay.
Aggressive.
Thank
What
you.
else you got?
You heard it here
Noted.
Yeah,
I
heard it
told
here.
Kristen that already, but.
Aggressive.
Noted. Thank you.
Right.
Board
Trust me,
President.
I can
Yes.
blow you off.
Maybe let Josie ask her question, because I think she hasn't asked anything yet.
That's
If we're-
absolutely fine.
if
Go
we're-
for it.
okay.
All right, so first of all, I just want to thank both of you. This is really insightful. I wanted to ask how long TCAPS has been doing this conducting the data protocol meetings and the response, and where the idea came from. Is it from Lipton and Wellman, or is it from professional development that someone in the district had years ago? And thirdly, the results. So Ms. Burwinkle, you mentioned how in your 10 years at Long Lake, you have seen improvement, and I'm just wondering how that's measured. We've got test score data, NWEA and MSTEP, but is there something else you're also looking at?
So as far as the data protocol, I think it's developed over time. When I first arrived at Long Lake, I was an interventionist the first year. And we did data meetings, but it wasn't as extensive and didn't involve as many people. It really was me and the principal and the other intervention staff that kind of met and looked at student data. But the more people who are involved, the more people who are invested, and then it becomes our students versus your students when they're with you. And we found value in involving more people as part of the decision making. And I can't imagine as a teacher, it can be intimidating at first you're looking at my kids' data and you're telling me whether they're making growth or not and how many qualify for intervention. And so the process was like baby steps. And I am proud to say it at my building, and I'm certain that Kirk's as well, that they welcome the opportunity to come together now. I think it was refined a little bit with my Excel, to be honest. Got data now what was part of the protocols and systems that were brought part of that system, and we've value that, and we've kept that as we've moved forward. And in the past year, it's really been streamlining this in all of the elementary buildings, because some of us do it a little bit more intensive than maybe others, and trying to find a protocol or like note-taking sheet that's pretty systematic across the buildings. Each of us does it a little bit different, and we own it, so it's hard to change, but we see the value in being consistent across all buildings. As far as growth, yeah, we have, like, you know, we've actually looked at the data from different programs that we used for intervention, so like Cars and Stars versus Phonics for Reading, and look to see if one shows more growth than others. As you know, there's so many variables involved when you're looking at data, and so it's trying to pull out what's most important and what you have most control over moving forward. And so I know when we're looking at the district-wide trends, some of the decisions that we're making as a district are because of maybe a lack of growth, or we really need to target this a little bit further. And so you'll kind of see how we're using what we have control over within our buildings, and then we're gonna back up a little bit and look at all elementary buildings, and then what are the decisions that we're making as a district to continue to move forward at a higher rate.
Anything to add?
What's that?
Did you have anything to add?
Oh, Kate did a great job. I was
Okay,
just-
great. Thank you.
Well, I'm being mindful of time.
Yeah.
One last question. Blair, it looks like in the kindergarten grade is where you have a significant amount of behavioral sort of things. Is that among 1 or 2 or 3 kids, or is that actually as a class you're seeing more behavior, and then as they are in the school system, over time it kind of mellows out and every year gets a little better?
I'll do my best to. It's individual students who are driving that. It's not a global thing, but there's 5 to 6 in each classroom that we have that are contributing to that. So you take that as a whole, that's 10 to 12 kids who are exhibiting, significant behavioral needs. And the other part of that, I remind my staff sometimes that once they turn the halls and go up into the upper L hallway, we do see that dramatic reduction. And some of that owes to their maturity, and then a lot of that goes to the systems we have in place to proactively teach the social emotional learning skills that they need to regulate their emotions, to be present and for instruction. And so that's a huge team-based effort. But yes, generally speaking, we see that, and that the data bears that out. Kindergarten's our highest, first is our next highest, then second grade, and then third, fourth, and fifth kind of are significantly less from that standpoint.
And that's how it's been for a number of years?
That's
Yes.
a great
Post-COVID,
question.
especially.
Yeah.
Post-COVID, before COVID?
I think
as
we're
well?
seeing, and we see this at all the schools. It's the kindergarten classes when students are coming in. I would say post-COVID, yes, but it's increasing on an annual basis as well. Like each class that comes in seems to be just experience a bit more challenge than the class that preceded it. So I don't want to say exponential because it's hard to put finite numbers on it, but it sure feels that way.
I guess I would just articulate that for our youngest learners that are coming into a formalized setting, it is really, really challenging, particularly if you're coming into that setting having not either ever experienced any kind of formal preschool, or you tend to be a child who has a lot of free reign, right? And when you walk into a school, you are walking into a mountain of expectations. And so it takes little humans a long time to figure out how to settle into that system. The other reality is that we do ask 5-year-olds to do an exorbitant amount of learning. So our experience as kindergartners is very different than what our kindergartners are experiencing. I did half days, and I know I did a rest period. Like, that doesn't happen. Like, we're all day, every day, and we're getting at it. So some of it is really, I think, again, this goes back to when we think of causal factors, and we think of infrastructure, and we think of leadership, we also have to think very strategically about what is the kindergarten experience like. If you're 5 years old and you're walking in and you're not necessarily walking in with a lot of skills to be available for learning, and we're going to hit you with learning right off the bat. So it is across the board that our K-1-2s, the data that you see at Blair and Long Lake mimic what you would see in all of our buildings. Our younger students really struggle. And they really struggle because there are a lot of expectations, and some of them really are, they are not developmentally or socially or emotionally ready to meet those. And so it creates a real challenge. So that is a huge thing that we have to think about when we're planning and we're preparing for our action steps. It's also something that I think we will get into a little bit more when we talk a bit about the science of reading and kids coming into our system from language-rich homes versus language-deficit homes, and how that gap actually grows exponentially. So I think we'll get into that a little bit more as we talk about our response as a district. If you don't mind, we'll move ahead.
Kirsten, in that vein, didn't we have like a real cutoff of Head Start programs in Michigan for?
Well, what's really interesting is that we actually have GSRP rooms. We could have more of them that we struggle to fill. So it is a mystery to think about how do we get early intervention during the most formative years of a human being's life, which is 0 to 5. Because quite honestly, sometimes 5 is already real behind the 8 ball, you know, so.
Step in the right direction is junior kindergarten.
Absolutely,
Like,
huge.
that has very much helped. Not having a 4-year-old in a kindergarten classroom asking them to sit for 20 minutes per bit. It's really prepared students for success, and we see that in the data. We've looked at NWBA data when we take it in JK, and then when they take it in kindergarten, and as they grow older, and when they have that strong start, we do see that their progress is significantly different than others.
Do you see a difference in kids coming from good daycare?
I don't know, I don't know that we have data on all of
Private
that.
data.
We don't know where
Because you guys
we don't know where they come from.
You don't know the
sometimes.
daycare resources.
Only one we generally know is GSRP.
Yeah.
You know, we don't get a lot, even Head Start's not coordinated in quite that way that I wish it was, you know, to have.
Yeah, because we kind of knew what daycare some of these kids came
Yeah,
from.
we run GSRP, you know, so with, you know, in our buildings, and so we have an idea. Head Start, a lot of them, like in Blair, it's at a strip mall, you know, other places, so we just don't have as tight of a fit with knowing that.
Do we still have like the early childhood initiatives, parenting communities that goes into the homes?
ISD.
The ISD does that
Okay,
now, yeah.
all right.
Birth to 3, there's
But that's if it's
Early on.
identified, right?
Right, early
Right.
intervention, trip, yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay.
Okay, so now we're actually going to turn our attention to district data. So as Kate said, we're going to zoom out and we're going to walk through basically doing the same kind of protocol that we performed with elementary building principals. This was in winter of this year. And really what we were looking at is the same kind of data that you have in the packet that was shared with you that we'll also present tonight. And as you're thinking about this, this is basically how we set up with building principles. So in that same vein, we are asking them to create those narrative statements that help them think about the patterns and trends that they see. And then eventually we move into the causal factors. So what are the things that we want to influence that we know impact student learning so that we can create a response plan? So that's kind of the exact same process that we would do with our grade level teams. Then we would zoom out and do at a district level. So,
All right, I'm gonna do my best to just talk us broad brush through the some of the math-related NWEA data. And so what you'll see on that left side is these are all spring scores. So that's kind of the cumulative impact of instruction from the beginning of school until students take the NWEA assessment in May. And so you'll see in 2018-19, so that was our pre-COVID year, the percentage of students scoring above the 60th percentile throughout the district in math. And remember that 60th percentile is what we project to be proficient on MSTEP and kind of gives us the idea that they're on track for grade level success. So in 2018-19, that was at 54%. So just 54% of all the elementary students in TCAPS were at or above the 60th percentile. We did not have scores in 1920, and then coming back from in 2020 and 2021, that number dipped to 51.6%. And then the next 2 years, in 2021 and 22 and 22-23, we saw a modest uptick in that percentage to land right at 52.5%. So about 52.5% of our students, K through 5, are performing at or above the 60th percentile on NWEA math. This is a look at each individual school. And so in kind of disaggregating this data, what we wanted to capture was what is the growth in the progress looked like since we returned from COVID? So that 2020 to 2023 timeframe. So that's the first kind of column on the left where it says net change at or above the RIT projection. And so we were just trying to get an idea of were kids making adequate RIT growth towards their projected RIT score. So that gives us an idea, is our instruction having the impact that it should? So if they're hitting that percent or that RIT projection, that's about a year's worth of growth. So you can see some of the highlights being we have some schools that really rebounded post-COVID, but still not quite to that level of our pre-COVID. So we've done well year on year from our return, but we still haven't, in many cases, returned to the pre-COVID levels we were at.
Too many shades of blue.
I know, that one's a tricky one to, yeah. All right, did you go to the next one? Okay, and this is then a look at that MSTEP proficiency. So in 2018-19, we're at 46.8%. And then we saw a dip coming back in 2020 and 21 to 40% of our students proficient on MSTEP. And then, again, a modest growth of just over 1% to 41.2% of our students in 21-22. And then the last school year, 41.7% of our students proficient on MSTEP math. And I think of note is NWEA is a K-5 assessment, whereas MSTEP is a 3rd through 5th grade assessment. So it's sometimes those percentages aren't going to align perfectly because the sample sizes are different, right? So we've got K-5 for NWEA and 3-5 for the MSTEP.
So I noticed in this one, there was in the initial NWEA, there was a drop for this 2023 from the scores from before. So with that, with the MSTEP, would that show that the ones in the younger grades actually came down? And that would account for that drop?
Can you say it one more time. I just want to make sure I
One of
understand.
The NWEA's, I think it was a couple slides back, and it showed that there was an increase in 2022,
Mm-hmm.
decrease in 2023. And then when you went to the M-STEP, it actually showed an increase in 2023.
Right.
Is that because the lower grades?
It could potentially.
Thank you.
It could potentially be that. It's also a 1/10 of a percentage point, so it's a really it's pretty fractional at that point. I think I'm not going to try to do the math right now, but it's pretty small. But yeah, that could. We haven't gotten to that level where we've dove that deep.
Well, and I think what Kirk is also explaining in the M-STEP scores, if you look at NWEA, that 52.4% last year includes K-5. So if you look at M-STEP, that's only 3.5.
That's what you're saying.
I think that's how
Yeah.
you're
That's
saying.
the point.
And so the fact that it's lower would indicate that actually our younger kids helped raise the overall percentage of students that were at the 60th percentile. If you pulled out 3.5, just NWEA, my guess is it would be pretty close to about 41.7%. Because that 60th percentile is a pretty darn good indicator of how kids are going to perform. Yep.
So I know it's challenging with all the different colors for the lines, but would it be possible for us to see what the national average is for the NWEA graphs and then the state average for all of the M-STEP graphs before these slides are finalized, and then for the upcoming sessions when we have middle school and high school results?
At least for NWEA,
That
50th
is.
percentile is middle of the road, because that's what it is based on. We get percentiles for students based on their studies, and 50th percentile is right in the national average. Does that make sense?
Well, so in other words, if our district hits 56.6 in a year,
We're above the national average for NWEA.
okay.
By
M-STEP, I'm not sure.
6 point.
M-STEP, we absolutely can get you state averages.
Okay.
I will say that we are consistently outperforming both state and our local districts on M-STEP in both math and ELA. I would also say that the state of Michigan has some of the lowest proficiency rates in the area of reading out of the entire country. So outperforming the state is not exactly our marker. We always are going to outperform the state. It's more of what we are looking at internally and recognizing, are we really comfortable saying 41.7% of our kids are proficient in math? No. Are we comfortable saying 50% are in English? No. So what are we going to do, regardless of the comparison?
Yeah,
And remember, at the upper, middle, and high school, it switches to PSAT, SAT,
for sure, yeah.
and all that
Yeah.
system.
M-STEP goes through 8th grade, right?
Parts,
Isn't it M-STEP?
only
Part-
parts.
and,
Social studies,
Mhm.
yeah, then it goes to PSAT at that point in 8th grade.
Yeah.
It's interesting on this chart in our packet, Montessori,
I noticed that too.
during the pandemic,
Mhm.
went up 6%.
So one thing I think that is really clear, and it's actually even clearer when we get into the ELA data, is that those buildings that we have kids that are coming from more at-risk backgrounds that are less likely to have reliable access to internet, less likely to have the kind of supervision that was needed during COVID, you do see a pretty marked decrease in that 2021 year. So that, and then conversely, I think you would see that, I mean, all of our schools were impacted with the one kind of outlier of Montessori, but the degree to which they were impacted is less significant than in our buildings that we know have a higher demographic of at-risk students.
So then moving on to English language arts proficiency, similarly. Overall, our reading proficiency is stronger
than math on NWEA and on M-STEP. But we're seeing similar trends when we're looking at data year over year. So a dip after the COVID years. And then for the most part, when we're looking at data, it's either flatlined or maybe gone up just a little bit. But I mean, our hope is that it would go up significantly over the past couple of years, and it's not making the growth that we would hope, given where we were prior to COVID. And I think as we're looking at all of this data, we're seeing that as an overall trend of, you know, we may be making growth, but really overall, we're not back where we were prior to COVID. So as a district, what are we doing about it? You know, what are our next steps in our action plans to help continue to boost those scores? So for ELA, NWEA school proficiency, you see, again, very similarly, you know, some of the schools are rebounding at a pretty good rate, but most still are in that negative on the far right column, where that is prior to COVID and then where we are last spring.
Do we have a sense of where TCAPS was 7 years ago, 8, 10, or more? I mean, I have no idea, you know, how 2018 compared to 5 or 10
Prior
years
to that.
prior.
So 2017 and 2018 was actually a really good year in terms of our student achievement. But one of the things that makes pulling that kind of data difficult is that the cut scores actually changed. So when you're looking at NWEA, they establish certain cut scores for percentiles. Those cut scores changed in 17, 18. And so it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to pull from that other than to see some kind of general trends. Prior to 17, 18, we actually were looking at the 50th percentile. We were using the average as being on track. If you had the 50th percentile or higher, we considered you to be proficient. So there's been some variability in not only the assessment itself, but also our understanding of how to use the assessment to be a better predictor to M-STEP. So that's partly why we didn't include all of that data, because it's not necessarily looking at apples to apples. And we really wanted to show the picture of when the cut scores were consistent and we were consistently measuring the 60th percentile.
And NWEA does a normative study every several years. And we want them to do that because what they do is they reevaluate what is 50th percentile, what is the national average, and then that gives us those cut scores. So that's what Kirsten's talking about when that changed. It was the normative study that came out right then in 2018-19. They gave us new, like, you know, a RIT score of this is the 50th percentile, a RIT score of this is the 60th percentile. Those changed between those 2 years.
The question, though, kind of can also be, that shows you the variance in your population over time, but your body of knowledge should not have changed maybe as you get further into math and science. Absolutely it does. But at the lower level, there's some basic reading abilities and comprehension and math. You know, and it seems like we could change where the bar is set, and that's not quite right.
Well, they actually like update the test every so many years, if that makes sense. NWEA, the company of NWEA, they want to update the assessment to make sure that it's valid and it's assessing those Common Core standards that we're teaching. So those change over several years, and they update that test and therefore update those norms as well.
Yeah, that would be an interesting study in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the 60th percentile is, you're saying it is kind of a static number. It's not the 60th of every year's everyone taking that test.
It's static. So I know from just being a part of TCAPS for several years that we looked at NWEA scores and M-STEP scores, and as a district, we determined that 60th percentile is where we wanted to be, because when you're looking at that alignment, that was pretty similar.
So, because initially I was I was thinking if that 60th percentile is a bell curve every year, maybe we're just not gaining as fast as other individuals that are like, you know what I mean? Maybe we're not losing ground, but we're just not gaining as much as maybe other districts are, their students are performing much better than ours are. And so but you're saying it's a static number. Okay.
Well, and I think what you'll see in the next couple slides actually does speak to growth. So what we're presenting right now would just be pure proficiency. Our kids actually at grade level. The next slides actually speak to, are they growing at a rate that would be expected compared to their peers? So NWEA gives you both. They give you proficiency, and they also give you like the rate in which a child, if you scored a 205 in the fall and you're in third grade, they have done all of the statistics to say this is where you should end up at a 217. They norm that out. So we'll present that as well. This is just saying that basically this is, again, looking at proficiency on the M-STEP, and you will see a much closer correlation to M-STEP proficiency in NWEA than you did in math.
Thank you for test score 101 for us. You're really good at it, so.
There's a lot to it.
Yep. And this is just 2 assessments, you know. So this is M-STEP for ELA, again, by building, and showing that growth prior to COVID and then rebounding after COVID the past couple of years. And we take M-STEP once a year in the spring, and that's 3rd through 5th grade students only.
Again, the positive numbers are good, the negative numbers are not. Right? In a nutshell. Again, I would say your particularly this graph, I think really highlights, that's Blair, Traverse Heights, and Silver Lake are the 3 lowest data points at that 2020-21. That would be directly coming back. And then you see Blair in particular has really rebounded related to NWEA. Still not at the place of where they needed to be, as has Silver Lake. And then we have other buildings that started off much higher that are struggling to get back to that place.
I'm curious if there is literature, peer-reviewed research that's come out that, has found that there is a curve to this post-COVID learning loss, abating. Is there a point at which we can reasonably expect that the growth will start taking off at higher percentage levels?
I don't know. I don't know. I guess I don't know that. I certainly feel like we're there. Like I feel like we're at the point where we are starting to see some incremental changes, and it's time to say, yep, COVID happened, and now what? The reality is, though, we do have kids going through our system that were in kindergarten, 1st grade, who missed the very core foundation that will then, I would say, trickle up, right, as they age. So if you missed foundational reading in kindergarten and 1st grade, or you got it very spotty, that is a hard thing to recover from, and it will be present until we go through the full cycle with kids.
I think earlier when we came back from COVID, there was TNTP is an educational kind of consortium that did some research, and that what they did is they looked at when New Orleans public schools returned from Hurricane Katrina, because that was the closest proxy to this situation. Obviously, that's a much smaller population, and so some of the findings from that paper are things that we incorporated into our approach from a curriculum and instruction standpoint in terms of trying to do our best to remediate those losses. But it's also from a peer-reviewed standpoint, we're still pretty close in close proximity to the actual event itself, and so kind of we're relying on trying to find those proxies and do the best we can with that information.
So Kirk, would you explain
Sure.
the...
Okay, so we're gonna shift gears a little bit and look at the same data sets. So we're gonna look at the NWEA data but take a look at the growth projection. And so what the assessment does for us is each student, based on where they score, the RIT score they get has an actual number of RIT points that they should achieve that would equate to a year's worth of instruction. And so what we track is the percentage of students who meet or exceed that projected RIT score. And so on the math, the top graphs, you'll see in 2018-19, that was at 60% of our students were meeting or exceeding their projected growth. And then coming back from COVID, we saw that drop to 53.8%, jump up to 54.8%, and then drop back down to 53.7%. So again, not back at that level that we would hope for, and also kind of remaining relatively static from the terms of percentage of kids meeting the projected growth. And similarly with the ELA, you'll see in 18-19, we're at 59% of students meeting their projected growth in reading, and then that really dropped pretty significantly then, 11.5 points down to 47.5% of students in 2020, 2021, and then rebounding to 52.4 and then 53.6%. Interesting, both ELA and math being like within 1/10 of a percentage point in terms of the percentage of students who are meeting that projected growth. And this is just a look again at the schools broken down by each elementary school and what that projected growth looked like in 2018-19, and then what it looked like for each of the successive years. And again, the two columns furthest right are looking at that net change. So how did we recoup that projected growth in the post-COVID years, and then what does that look like in comparison to pre-COVID to post-COVID? And I like how Kirsten put it. You know, the positive numbers are good, and the negative numbers are not.
Areas for growth.
Yes. Yep. And this is the same information, just looking at the ELA scores and specific to each school.
You can see that trend of ELA, that huge drop from prior to COVID.
Oh, hold it. So sorry. I don't know what's going on with the clicker.
No worries. That projected RIT is basically, we want students to maintain their percentile or grow in percentile as they grow in grades or every time they take the test. And so what it's doing is it projects what their RIT will be if their percentile stays the same. And if they exceed it, then obviously that's even better. And so there was a big dip from prior to COVID to after COVID. And I think just in general, as the principals are looking at this data, like there's not like a huge trend other than things like this. When you're looking at it, you're looking for things that most schools or a lot of schools participate in, and to identify what is causing this. And I think what we're seeing is that, you know, that was a significant disruption to education, and we're struggling to continue to progress at the rate that we want to. So then what are the things that we're doing as a district to really dig down and target some of that support? And in math, we just switched curriculum materials last year. So we have a new curriculum. And so we don't know, did that play a factor in some of the math scores? There's, again, so many different variables. But there's so many factors involved, and you don't know for a couple of years whether you're actually making progress or not. So it's hard when you're looking at this global data to really drill down unless you're seeing global trends to identify next steps as a district. And that's what we tried to do as a leadership team of like, what are those global trends and what do we want to target? Because you can't do it all. If you try to do it all, you're going to muddy the waters for everything, and you're not going to see growth. So we really need to identify the things that are most important, and then as a district, really hone in on that and do that well, and then you can expand one step at a time.
So this is an opportunity to ask some more questions about the actual data you see And then we'll move into exactly what Kate described, which is our action plan or our response plan.
Do you take this into account when you evaluate your curriculum? So if you retrospectively look at it 2 years down the line after you've purchased it? Okay, good.
And we are really there with ELA right now.
Yeah, I
So we've
understand that.
identified in curriculum committee and others, you know, we've had some serious reservations with components of the
Journeys.
journeys. And
Journeys,
so
yeah.
right now, we're going through that pilot that has consumed a bunch of these folks' time right now and trying to really figure out, talk to experts, look at the science to try and put something there that we think is very solid.
And
in
address
that
the
aspect.
gap areas that we have.
And we learned from the MAC pilots too, because, my building was a part of the pilot and we piloted something that was not
Math
true.
expressions
And
versus,
so
yeah.
we've had multiple, like we're on our third math program in 4 years, 5 years. And so that plays a factor too, because each program teaches it in a different way, uses different language and vocabulary. So does that play a factor in some of these data pieces? We're not sure, and we're not gonna hang our hat on that's the excuse, but we wanna really do it right with reading so that we're not spending a whole year piloting something that isn't chosen. We really wanna find the right thing, but impact as little students as possible.
I have a quick question, but if you're going to get into it in the next session, just say, wait. Have you tried to correlate some of these test scores and like how we're rebounding from COVID to things that we've already talked about, like number of behavioral health or number of behavior incidents, classroom sizes? And if you have, just
Yeah.
say, we're going to wait on that. But
We're not gonna have any slides for that. So, yeah, I think generally speaking, I know Kate and my team as well, we kind of infuse that behavioral data when we're having those data meetings to try to tease that out, whether it's, is this a skill deficit in academics or is it a skill deficit in like social emotional skills? And so trying to tease that out at a building level or even a grade level. We have not done it to that degree at a whole district level. I think that could be potentially pretty cumbersome to tease out, but for sure at a site-based level, we definitely.
I'm just thinking like, an incident is going to impact obviously more than just the individual that's having the incident. It's going to impact probably that whole room for a period of, 10, 15 minutes, however long that might last. But, just thinking like, as those incidents rise, the impact of them seem to maybe be having an impact on the whole setting.
I think if you look at the behavior data coming out of buildings that we know are historically a higher percentage of students that are at risk, that is very much directly related to the achievement data you see. So if you look at even just Blair's behavior data and you look at the actual number of times that office discipline referrals are happening or proactive requests, 931, right? Now that trend is very consistent. At Long Lake, you'll see that trend is, she went from in 2021-22, 36 to now up to 257. That's a significant number. It's not 931, right? But that is still a significant number. Then when you look and you compare Blair's achievement data to Long Lake's achievement data, even in those classrooms that you have, there is no question that the amount of disruptive behavior not only is impactful of the student, but it is impactful of everyone around them. So if you see 50 instances of disruptive behavior, you can assume that at least 50 times learning stopped for not necessarily even just that classroom, but perhaps the kids that were in the neighboring hallways. So you cannot attack one without attacking the other. It really has to be done in a very cohesive way because there is no question that it does have impact. It's hard to learn if what's happening around you is so distracting that you're not able to attend to the most relevant, salient pieces of information. it's equally hard to learn if you're coming into the learning environment having 50,000 less words than your peers 10 miles down the road. So that's why when we say it is an interwoven, dynamic thing to consider, you can't impact student achievement and not be addressing behavior, and you can't impact behavior and not recognize that it's also really hard to behave well if you can't read. That doesn't feel good, you know, so all of it plays into each other.
And I would assume it's probably disproportionately more impactful in the lower grade, the lower grades, so K1, 2, like an incident in that setting is going to be much more impactful on the whole group as opposed to, you know, 7th, 8th, 9th high school. Like, I mean, I feel like the older you get, the more you're going to rebound from a disruption.
Because it's not those fundamental skills.
Right.
And some of that too comes down to teachers as well, and their skill set, because I know I have some kindergarten teachers who are phenomenal at having the disruption and moving on and ensuring that learning continues, and so that there is some of that kind of individual variance based on the skill set of the educator as well. And I think I don't know, we walk a fine line. I think I want to acknowledge that impact of the behavior, and I also we can't go so far as to say that and kind of throw our hands up and be like, well, they're not behaving, so we can't teach. And we're really trying to ride that line. And I believe firmly that our kids more than anything deserve to have those equitable opportunities to grow and learn in spite of what's happening in front of them. So we kind of take it a bit of like, this is what it is, and we're going to do our best to educate both the academic component and the behavioral component, because that's what we do. But that impact it's there for sure. But I think that it's also it's not an excuse for us. It's something that we try to work through every day.
Just a technical question. Did you maintain roughly the same class size when kids came back from COVID? Or did you try to add teachers and instructional staff?
I would have to look. I mean, our class sizes, I think at my school it fluctuates based on,
Class sizes are contractual.
yeah, and there's a district calculation that goes into that part, and how many teachers we are allocated.
Okay.
So
So
the
Do we have
district
more
as a
support?
whole,
Yeah.
we added,
Yes.
I want to say 17 FTE over the 3-year period of additional teachers. Eliminated many splits across, so you remember all the splits that we've added in split support. So we've added quite a bit of instructional staff compared to the numbers we had post-COVID or pre-COVID.
And that would also, I would think, be to the benefit of the teachers as well, you know. 'cause
That was a
they've gotta
net
be
17,
sane.
I believe so.
a net
Dealing
increase.
with it.
And at the same time, we've had declining enrollment, so
Yeah.
that student to
That's
teacher
important.
ratio improved.
And,
Got,
like, we're fortunate at my school, we typically have additional FTE, like we kind of round up the calculation to ensure that because we know that some
We
of our
give Blair
kids-
and Traverse Heights an extra FTE to do exactly what you're asking.
Good.
And then that's also when they went on a special schedule too as well, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Well, are you talking about for
piloted.
early
Blair and
release?
Tyler-
Yes.
Blair and
Yes,
Traverse
that,
Heights.
that has run, I mean, that grant ran out, but yes, there was also that,
But that's been gone now this is the second year?
second year.
Second year.
without it? Oh, okay.
So just because I just would like to offer that we move into the phase of the conversation where we talk about what we're going to do, because I think that's really important. And then we will have another opportunity. If there are anything we didn't address, we can circle back to it. I am wondering, do you need a break, or do you want to just keep pulling?
I think it's fine as long as, and if you need a break, obviously take that. But
Good? Okay.
and obviously, if anyone needs to leave, just go ahead.
Okay. So if you want to just.
So, data overview, again, like as we're looking at a district level, what are some of the narrative statements that we're noticing and trends that we're seeing across the buildings? We are seeing a slight increase in proficiency since 2020.
but overall not fully rebounding. We are seeing that, we feel we should be making stronger growth over time. We're not satisfied with 50%. We're not satisfied with the growth we're making. So we really want to target, instead of trying to broadly tackle everything, we want to focus on one area and do that right, and then move on to the next area. And I feel like over the past couple of years, we have had to do it all. Different science curriculum, we've updated social studies curriculum, we've had different math curriculum. So we've had cell curriculum, and you have to think at the elementary level, it's a little bit different than a secondary. You have a secondary teacher who teaches math and teaches maybe that same math course multiple times during the day. An elementary instructor teaches it all, and we still have the same amount of professional learning that all the teachers do within the whole district, and also planning time is the same, yet they are required to cover all of that. And so that's where we feel like maybe that is muddying things, and we really need to hone in a little bit more. So that was kind of our charge as a group. And then also looking at those behavior and data trends, trying to tackle that. Having a tier 1 cell curriculum, that is new. We never had that prior to a couple of years ago. And so that's setting that foundation for social and emotional regulation, being able to manage big emotions, and building in tier 2 and tier 3 supports in the area of behavior and social and emotional needs. So these, again, are a little bit more specific statements. So approximately 54% of our students are proficient in reading and writing, and approximately 52% of our students are proficient in math. So that's general narrative statements when we're looking at all of the data. And organizing and integrating, again, what are our response plans? So what content area do we want to focus on? What causal factors are we prioritizing? Because we know all of those things are different variables that all play a role into that progress. And so we can't tackle it all. What are we wanting to focus our efforts on? And then what are our action steps as a district?
So as a group, we really have identified that we are going to be focusing specifically on English language arts over the next several years. And we established a district SMART goal. So our SMART goal is really related to that proficiency. 54% of our students being proficient in reading is really not an acceptable percentage, right? We recognize that we need far more kids to actually hit that mark by the time they leave elementary school. So our goal is to see a 3% increase in increments over the next 5 years. And we really have looked at those causal factors to determine how are we going to make those gains. So what you see is the causal factor listed, and then what our priority response will be. So for teacher expertise, if you think back to when we were first discussing causal factors, I said the single greatest thing that influences student learning is building the capacity and expertise of teachers. So one of our big overarching priorities is focused on professional learning. One of the barriers to that, or concerns to that, is we actually have pretty limited opportunities to do professional learning. Our calendar isn't particularly conducive to that. We get 3 full days. 2 of them happen at the very beginning of the school year. 1 happens in November, and then we have PLCs that are sprinkled through that. So recognizing that as a limitation, what do we do then to make sure that we are maximizing the contact that we have with teachers? Another causal factor is related to instructional strategies. So that's really that how of you teach. What are the decisions? What do you decide to do? What do you decide not to do in the classroom? So that's related to explicit instruction. We're going to tell you a little bit more about that. And then curriculum. Specifically looking at that language arts curriculum and ensuring that it is aligned to best practice and research. We do have some barriers to that that I think our team can speak to. and actually things that we are trying to figure out as a system, how could we possibly finesse and refine? So those are some of the conversations that we're having. Obviously, we have continued refinement of mental and behavior supports. We know that our kids have needs. We know that we have to continue to think about all of the ways in which we can support those needs. I think we are making lots of strides in getting the right personnel in front of staff, but oftentimes, as you see, it's hard to have enough boots on the ground. So there are these are finite resources. We have to figure out how to maximize them and put them in front of kids. Infrastructure, you heard both Kirk and Kate talk about block scheduling. That's something that we'll likely look at prioritizing across the district and across all elementaries. And then that leadership component. How are we making sure that our principals are ahead of the learning so that they in turn can push that information out to their staff?
And just for perspective with that, when I first started as principal at Long Lake, I appreciated the freedom to do what I thought was best within my building, but then how do I know that it's aligned to the district's structure and goals? And one of the things that Kirsten has really brought in her role is that systemized approach to professional learning, to making sure that we're all kind of focusing on something together, we're learning together. And one of the ways is through explicit instruction, where she's helped us as leaders learn those strategies, get research-based support, and then we help to support that within our building. Prior to when I first started, the PD days were however I wanted to do it, which again, I like a little bit of flexibility, but I also want to make sure that I'm supporting the growth of our entire district. And that's not always been the case in past years.
Can you explain real quick, because I know what a block schedule looks like in high school, but I don't know what it looks like at an elementary school.
Yeah, I think, so we will block out the specific times that, say, all our second grades are teaching ELA. And then we'll tag a 30-minute section on the end of that, or at the beginning, just depends on how it works out, so that students can all receive their intervention. And that way we ensure that kids aren't missing core content, but that all students have the opportunity to get intervention. So
what you saw that Kate showed earlier, how they had the different groupings in that, that was that block system.
in my building, we do a 30-minute block of intervention time, and then for ELA, it would be a 90-minute block of core instruction, which can get
That's a long time
It can
for
get
elementary.
really tricky too when we look at our special schedule, because that drives our ability to build our building schedule. So we get the special schedule, and if I have 7 PE sections on Tuesday, then I've got to schedule those in and then build my schedule around that. And for art, I might have 9 sections of art on a Thursday, and 3 of them are upper L, so that's 45 minutes, and the rest are 30 minutes because they're lower L, and then I have to build my block schedule around that. So those variables really drive how efficient we can be with our scheduling, and it can be problematic to ensure that we have that block schedule to deliver intervention and core instruction to our kiddos.
Can I offer, I know you guys have had long days, please bring your chairs up and sit down if you need to, and you can get up and speak, but you don't have to stand there the whole time. I feel bad for you.
Have a place at the table.
Right?
The other thing that block scheduling can allow is a common planning time. And so, which is, as we move through and as as Kelly and Emily are going to talk about our science of reading work and the curriculum adoption, having consistent, planned collaboration time is going to be critical in making sure that we are implementing the program well. So when we talk about infrastructure, we tend to go, oh, well. Actually, I think that is some of the work that we need to do over this next year, is make sure that we are actually setting our teachers up with common planning time that is consistent to the best that we can, like working within the constraints that we have. So we've just begun that conversation with HR. We've begun to say, hey, can we think about the special schedule from the lens of what the building needs? Because when you're doing the special schedule, you're thinking about how do I eliminate people having to drive and be in lots of buildings, and those are sometimes competing needs. So we're gonna work through that, I think, as a district to say, how do we make sure common planning time is a priority as well as that common differentiated time. So that's what that really means.
I have another question. Why did you choose ELA in preference over math?
In terms of our action plan,
Yeah.
I think that one of the big driving factors is that long-term like a student's ability to read is predictive of their ability to be successful in society. While the mathematics is exceptionally important, and I don't want to minimize that importance, but being able to be a literate person within society is kind of a foundational necessity. And when we first started working with MyExcel quite a few years ago, one of the things that struck me that I heard about is, and I don't know how true this is or not, but someone said that they project prison populations based on third graders' ability to read. So as you project that out, and that just stuck. I think quite a few of us heard that, and like that is one of the most impactful things I've heard as an educator, and really kind of gives that urgency around the English language arts and ensuring our kids can read and write.
Because I just feel like both of them are so important. And I feel that I was always a very strong reader. So I was going to take care of that regardless. My kid was going to be a very strong reader. Math was going to be more of a challenge for discipline.
And I think some part of that too is we're adopting a reading curriculum, and we have just adopted a math curriculum. So we did put in some of that professional learning work around the instruction and around mathematics. And so we do, as we adopt this ELA curriculum, we want to make sure we kind of support our teachers and our students with onboarding that. And it's not. I think it's also, to your point, we're not going to ignore math and not look at math at all. That's still going to be a part of that data review protocol. And explicit instruction is actually a fantastic way to teach mathematics and ensure that students are getting access and practice with those critical mathematical skills.
It's just really important to recognize that when you only have a certain number of touch points to do professional learning with staff. I think it's Covey that said, if you prioritize everything, you prioritize nothing. And when you are a teacher that has to teach all content areas, and you only have these limited times, for us to be efficient in moving that needle, we have to pick something to be going very intentional and deep into. Otherwise, we're sort of ping-ponging around. So in no way do we want to say that other content areas aren't important. They are extremely important. It's simply that when we're talking about prioritizing professional learning, that's going to be the focus.
So I have a couple of questions, actually, if you go back. I just want to say, first of all, I really like the logic of all this. This is the way my brain works. I like that you've identified the impediments, the challenges, and the solutions. I want to roll back, though, one slide to the SMART goal. And I know that stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So the achievable would be the A, attainable. I have to say, like, I don't know what anybody's ultimate dream would be to see, where TCAPS would land in terms of proficiency. Would it be 60%? Would it be 80, 90? Our dream goal. But to see 3% over the next 5 years,
Increment.
Each year.
annually, 3% annually? Okay, so not 3% over the 5 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, because I was like, we're a little lowballing here, aren't we? I mean, I get that we want to be achievable, but, okay, that's helpful.
And
So,
is that compounding, or is that just straight 3%?
I did a straight 3% increment. However, our lovely reading specialist would tell you, and I don't want to give away their slide, that actually should be a rather ambitious number.
yeah,
That actually there are far higher percentages of kids that could become literate than do. And that it is the direct result of how we are instructing them and the program that we're putting in front of them. So I think this is doable. I think the reason why I would say 5 years is any program that you adopt, you are going to spend some significant time just figuring out what's on the next page. And that's realistic. Teachers have all content areas. When you are giving them a brand new program, they need some time to actually figure out, like, they don't know what comes next. They've never seen it before.
Yeah.
So,
yep. And then if you could just go to the next page here, I want to revisit what you said about professional learning, professional development, because this is really important. And I have wondered about this over the years, if this was an impediment, that we are too limited. So I want to ask, what can we as a Board of Education do to help? I mean, is there something, I don't know what the constraints are. Is this legal? Is
Well,
I mean, is there something like,
teachers have to have 5 days
Mhm.
of professional development per year for their certificate. We have to have 180 days of instruction. We have 187
I thought two.
work days. Work days.
But work days? I thought 100.
187.
Is it?
And so, for anything additional compensation for that time, we would have to compensate.
It'd be
our folks
overtime.
for that.
basically overtime?
pay
Well,
for
no,
it.
it would
Yeah.
actually have to be embedded in the number of days
Mhm.
that our professional staff work. And so you have to have the
If we
the
bumped it to
financial
190.
resources to do that, and you have to have an agreement, a part of that contract bargaining to be able to do that.
Right. So, I mean, do
For
we?
example,
oh, yeah.
I came from a district that had an early out every week. But then there are requirements for instructional minutes and days, so then that has to be added in a different place.
Mhm.
And then you have to compensate your staff because they're still here for the early out.
Right.
A lot of different factors.
So what would that cost us to add one professional development day? I
A
mean,
month or just in general?
one calendar day per academic year. Not saying one day is enough, but I'm just curious, does anybody have a price for that?
No,
Have to-
it's,
Your email is full of
it's,
We'll have to get back
Bring
to you
it
on that
on.
one, Josie. I don't have
I
that.
mean, yeah. I
my
mean,
guess would be over $500,000 a
Yeah.
day.
mm-hmm. Okay.
At least.
I mean, it's good to know. I mean, because
You can find that out, but if I'm
we're
guessing,
the
I'm
Board of
just figuring
Education, we've got to be
we're a
part
$100
of the
million
solution
budget,
here too.
85% divided by days, it's probably somewhere in there from that standpoint of what it would cost us is my guess. But I'll find that out. I know, I've heard it, what a day costs us from that
Mhm.
standpoint. But, I can get that for sure. But it's considerable. And again, you have to have an agreement with, your employee groups. to
Of
do-
course. Yep.
And sometimes we try some creative workarounds, like we provide subs, right?
When we can, which is a struggle.
Which is hard
And costly.
And cost.
and costly, and quite honestly, a day of missed instruction,
Oh, yeah.
right? So it's a little bit.
Compromised anyway.
It's, but I do think, to your point, it
Mhm.
is really important that we think about it. Like, if these are the number of days, is there anything different in how we're structuring those days? And I think
Yeah.
those are good conversations to have.
And like, I think Kate had mentioned, there are some districts that do an early release every week.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So the burden many times on parents and folks that we hear with that. And transportation being so large. So that's a barrier for us compared to some other places.
Right. I think, this Board of Education wants to be part of the solution. And going back to the beginning of your presentation about the 6 causal factors and leader expertise, you were talking at the building level with principals, but when we go to Michigan Association of School Boards conferences, they talk about the importance of the board, its policies, its leadership, its vision. So if we can be part of the solution, you know, that's why I'm asking for these numbers and these ideas, and maybe we have to live with 3 professional development days per year for the time being, but then think about, well, what are we prioritizing? What's the process for identifying what those PD days will be focused on?
And let me
Just
clarify,
something new.
it's 5. It's actually
5 days.
5. It's just that we have 3 that are full days, and then we have the remaining days are parsed out
Equaling 2
through
days.
those PLCs.
The
Yeah,
teacher collaborative routines.
Yes.
Yeah,
yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But for
Appreciate
the
it.
first time, we do have a professional learning committee that we've not had, where we actually work with, we have TCA representation, we have that, and we're actually really focusing hard on making sure we're maximizing all of that together so that we're not just doing something that doesn't have a direct result of trying to do what we're trying to do.
With input from teachers and administrators from across the district, which we haven't had either.
Any other questions on this slide? Okay. So I'm going to say thank you very much to Kate and to Kirk for that. And then I'm going to introduce Kelly and Emily, who are, as I said, both instructional coaches, and they are also both really very, very skilled in teaching kids how to read. They're part of our language arts curriculum committee. And what they're going to talk about is a little bit more in depth about our response plan, specifically, again, working on teacher expertise, instructional strategies, curriculum, and infrastructure. So, in essence, this quote sort of sums up what we're hoping to do, which is to increase teacher knowledge and their understanding of what we call the active ingredients of reading. So that's that science of reading, in order to implement high quality curriculum materials. And again, this last part really talks about that interdynamic play between these causal factors. Materials alone are not enough, and we need to make sure teacher expertise or knowledge is aligned to science. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily and Kelly, and they'll talk a little bit about what the program is going to look like.
Hi, I'm Emily Woody. I work at Blair Elementary. Thank you so much for your time and consideration in all of this. I think, as the data suggests and my colleagues have suggested, the trends are not what we'd like to see. I don't think we are all satisfied with having half of our kids not proficient in reading. And so we are starting to look to the science of reading, and I invite you to take a minute to look at the quote on the left. You would read it to yourselves. I think speaking as a teacher and an instructional coach that comes from Blair Elementary, I can speak that reading does exponentially and adversely affect our most vulnerable students, and science of reading is one way that we can combat that. The science of reading is a scientifically based teaching pedagogy to ensure strong literacy skills, and it combines 2 core strands of literacy instruction, which Kelly will be talking about in just a minute. So proficiency in reading is more than a skill. It's also a gateway to success. And then these statistics that we're going to go over show the profound impact of reading difficulties and why there is such an urgency in implementing a science of reading-based curriculum. And focusing on the why helps people understand and be more motivated and inspired to engage in the process. And they're also more likely to accept change if we understand the reason for it. So just kind of in your head thinking about what percentage of students can learn to read.
Go ahead if anybody wants to share their thought.
100%.
No, I don't think it's quite that high. Because dyslexia and some other things can be going on.
So we have about 50%. If you were just to say The actual percentage, when you say, what could we attain? What could we get to? What do you think that might be?
I mean, there are kids here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Aside from that, I think it'd be
Yeah.
You are correct, that'd be 95% of kids can read, so we can't settle for 50% for sure. What grade is pivotal in acquiring fundamental word recognition skills? Word recognition skills are those base skills that are needed for comprehension and knowledge-based learning.
Pre-grade? I don't know.
Second
Second,
grade?
I hear second.
Second?
No,
I was
I
going
hear
even
second.
earlier. I was going earlier.
Said
I
second. I
said
hear
0,
first.
-1.
First or second?
It's actually
Yeah.
fourth grade.
Oh, wow.
And this is why it's really important. Right now, this year, in order to enhance our program that we're currently using Journeys, we've implemented ECRI, which is a foundational skills program. We've implemented that K2. And that is why when we are researching the programs that we're using right now, that we see the need to implement a program that goes K5. Because kids in fourth grade still have not acquired those foundational skills to the level that they need to be successful.
Do we still test them in third grade? For reading? So why is it that we test them in third grade instead of fourth grade?
You mean for foundational reading skills? Actually, the foundational reading tests really only extend to about second grade. And that's just what's available to us. So if you're actually talking about base skills, when our curriculum, or almost all curriculums, base skills, those word recognition skills, almost all stop in third grade. If we were to hit that 95% group, we would likely need to ensure that all students K through 5 are getting base word recognition, explicit instruction. So we have to find, again, a program that actually ensures that that's going to happen.
The thing is, though, is I think that there are kids, and I don't know what proportion, that actually are doing fundamental word recognition far earlier than fourth grade.
Oh, they
'Cause
are
I
doing
was
it
reading
far
a book
earlier.
a day in
yes.
They
fourth
just
grade.
haven't reached the capacity that they have or that we want them to be at by fourth grade. Those foundational skills start very early.
Yeah,
And
they
there are
do.
plenty of kids that are more advanced than that. We're saying this is pivotal, that they must have it by this point.
Students not proficient in reading at third grade are how many times less likely to graduate from high school on time?
10.
And I would agree, though, it feels like it should be a lot, right? Based on the data, but about what % of Michigan's elementary teachers are currently using curriculums aligned with the science of reading?
I don't know, but I just hope we're not one of them.
40%?
This is
Under-
how
you
many
do the
are?
over-under.
So, yeah, how many are? I'm sorry.
They are using it.
Oh, how many
So
are?
how many are using curriculum assigned to the science of reading?
Let's be optimistic and say 60?
50%.
We just went
30.
through
Thirty.
that
30%.
debate, yeah.
We'd like
30.
to increase that and be part of that.
So our Journeys right now does not
Does
meet
not.
that standard,
Oh.
I believe it.
Oh.
I
Yes.
believe it. I told you it was.
which is
it
why
was
we're going
bad.
through the process we are right now.
It was bad.
So with the purchase, we've just made a purchase for next year, right?
We have not yet.
Not
It
yet.
is
It's a
being right now reviewed.
Yeah,
and
we're
so
close, okay.
Well, we'll see.
We're really- That's
They're
right.
working their tail off.
I mean,
I'll
we're
say
expecting
that.
it for next
Could be
school
one
year,
of the reasons
so.
why our reading scores are so low. Okay. As a
Yes.
state.
The number of years it may take educational research to reach classrooms.
10?
I was thinking high, but lower. That was 17, jeez.
17
Whoa.
years, so we can't wait that long.
You had a kid graduate from high school by then.
Terrible.
If you do any research on the science of reading, one of the things they talk about is that this is research that has actually been available for decades, 50 years or more. And yet educators have been at odds with what neuroscientists have proven is how kids learn to read. So there's this disconnect between science and practice, and we have seen evidence of that in our district for sure. And yes, I do think it is likely why we have some depressed reading scores.
Scientific research has shown how children learn to read and how they should be taught, but many educators don't know the science and in some cases actively resist it. As a result, millions of kids are being set up to fail. I think, science of reading, when I went through the education system, learning and getting my teaching degree was not a part of my education. I've had to go outside and do letters training, and I have colleagues that have done MC training to learn about it so we can become better educators and meet the needs of the kids that we are failing right now. The process of learning to read is the same for everybody, but the difference is about 5% of us will learn to read without any instruction. Another 35% of us will learn to read with baseline instruction, which leaves kind of where our kids are right now. Over 50% of the kids that need systematic and explicit instruction in the science of reading and those foundational skills in order to be successful. We don't learn in a different way, we just need different measures of instruction in order to get there.
Question. Was all this research also on English language? I'm thinking other languages could have a different,
Yes.
yeah, this is all English.
Okay, hi. I'm Kelly Obranovic. I'm an instructional coach at Eastern and also on the curriculum committee. Thank you for having me. I had 2 hours to get nervous, so just bear with me. So what is the science of reading? It's a vast body of scientifically based research. So it's not a philosophy, it's not a fad or a trend, or as some of us say, like a pendulum swing, right? It's also not a program. Like, it is research, it is science, and it's, like Kirsten was saying, people have been actively resisting it because it's not necessarily how educators were initially taught, right? And now that some of this is catching up to us, we're having an opportunity to engage in it and really buy into the value that it provides students. Although it's been around for decades, it's gained traction in just the last few years. And while this potentially leads to misunderstandings, and as a result, it's important to have clarity in what it really is. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. Yes, so this is, there are 2 main theoretical frameworks that are used to connect this back to instruction. And this one is the most simplistic way to view it, and it's called the Simple View of Reading framework. This has since been validated by over 150 different scientific studies. And what you can see in this framework is that if either of these components are weak, reading comprehension is diminished. So you can see how if you were to have strong skills in word recognition but not language comprehension, you're still not going to become that skilled reader with that reading comprehension. If you were to just have partial skills in word recognition and partial skills in comprehension, you are not partial skills in language comprehension, you are not going to achieve that full skilled reading comprehension. So this is a really simple way to look at it. And what you can see is that the comprehension is not actually a strategy, it's an outcome. So when these 2 things are in place, comprehension is gained. And actually, I learned a new stat recently that a student has to have like 95 to 97% accuracy in reading what they're reading in order to be able to tell you the main idea of what is happening. So your word recognition skills and your knowledge background has to be so strong in order to be able to actively engage with the text that you're reading. Okay, so this is my favorite. I love Scarborough's rope. I hope I do it justice, so bear with me for a minute. This is a more complex way of looking at the science of reading, but it breaks down this concept even further. It's a visual metaphor, so it helps to show us the development of skills over time, and that the result is not because of one singular skill, but instead a set of like interwoven processes. Humans have been using spoken language for like 60,000 years, whereas print And reading and writing, it just dates back 5,000 years ago. So when we're thinking about like evolutionary time, the human brain is still adapting to actually learning to read. It's considered like an intervention, similar to like us learning to drive a car. So that's biologically secondary, right? It's not happening right away. So what do these pieces tell us? The top part there is language comprehension, and that is something that students gain from their environments, which is why we consider it biologically primary. And we see a lot of students that when they don't have experiences or background knowledge, that directly impacts their ability to be successful in this strand. This is your knowledge area. This is where you're gaining all of that knowledge around content areas, and you're putting those pieces together. Down below is the word recognition strand, and this is really your skills and your decoding. This is the area where students really need to be explicitly and systematically taught how to do this. And if they are not explicitly and systematically taught this, they really struggle to be successful. So both of these things need to be in place in order for skilled reading to happen. We see in K2, students really working on these skills on that left side. And then as they progress through elementary school in 3-5, that all kind of starts to come together. So to the point of the 4th grade stat, right, all of those things become pivotal for that student to actually be able to be successful in the content that is presented to them in 4th grade. I'm just gonna make sure I didn't miss anything, so I'm talking really fast. Yeah, so I think one of the other really important things to mention is just that these things have to be explicitly taught. So our brain is constantly mapping through something called orthographic mapping, and in order for that to happen, those pieces need to be in place. So as an educator, a coach, and a previous teacher and parent of young kids, I think it's like a crucial shift in practice to ensure that reading instruction is based in this scientific research and how our brains truly learn to read.
The only thing I would want to add is when we talk about that top part of that rope, and when Kelly said that is largely influenced by environment, that's when we're talking about the difference between students coming in from the language is always language-rich homes versus language-deficit homes. And so, in essence, the more words you know, the better of a reader you will become. And so, not only are kids, if they are coming from more of a disadvantaged starting point, that gap actually becomes even wider, because the more you know, the more you're able to process and scaffold off of. So when we're thinking about reading instruction, we often think about it in terms of that bottom part, decoding, right? Like how do they know their syllabication, and how do they break apart words? But what is equally pivotal is that we actually provide the background knowledge for them to have something to kind of launch off of. So you can't become a skilled, literate human without both of these things being in play. And as teachers, the only way you do that is by this very systematic, explicit approach. So when we're talking about, as Emily's about to get into kind of thinking about the actual curriculum itself, we're really trying to think of how we meet both of those components.
There may be one monkey wrench being thrown into this, though, and that is the advent of screens. That they're saying that as we're using more and more screens, that it is remodeling how kids are perceiving and dealing with the world, how they think. And it will be interesting to see if this impacts.
One of the things that we are looking at when we're going through the adoption process is what kind of background knowledge that the curriculum builds, because we know we need to even the playing field, right? So when we're talking about instruction and knowledge instruction in particular, we can't rely on the understanding that every kid should know this. And so if the curriculum itself is doing the background knowledge building, then we are building it for them so they can be successful, which will kind of even that, should and hopefully will even that So as our curriculum team started and why our focus is ELA this year, we started with a selection team. And that selection team vetted several different curriculum, and we narrowed that down using the Reading League tool to vet that program. And the Reading League tool is kind of a rubric of sorts, just like we use for teaching, for us to rate each program. And once we did that, we narrowed it down to 2 different programs that Kelly's going to talk about. But in that process, our selection team has designated a significant amount of time. We also now have pilot team members, which are classroom teachers, but we have people from the EL department, the Indigenous department, the ISD. We have coaches and interventionists and teachers, all a part of this decision-making process, from different grade levels across the schools, to make sure that we are doing our due diligence when we're picking a program, because we know how important it is.
Okay, so like Emily said, we've been working really hard on this, and one of our main visions is that we wanted to make sure that whatever we were looking at aligned with the science of reading, right? And that everything in it was explicit and systematic. And so that was one of our first starting points in our broad umbrella kind of statement. And from there, we've done extensive time together just talking about different variables. But what we came down to is we have it's technically 3 different programs, but bear with me for a second. The first one is CKLA, and that one covers both the word recognition and language comprehension, so both strands of the reading rope. And that program is all inclusive in that it includes both those pieces. The other ones that we're looking at are 95% group and Wit and Wisdom. 95% group is a program that focuses on word recognition. It's explicit and systematic in decoding and encoding. And then language comprehension would be Wit and Wisdom, which is building that knowledge in a layered approach. So helping to support students, like Emily was saying, and Kirsten, to build background knowledge within the curriculum so that we can make it more equitable for all students. And this can be done in a variety of ways to support that language comprehension knowledge part of the reading rope. And then when we put these 2 things together, in theory, we have this fabulous reader that increases our scores and has a wonderful life.
Thank you. So I'm actually skipping the question slide just for everyone's sake. I think you'll be here forever if we don't. So the other thing that we wanted to offer was just that you hear us referencing explicit instruction. And so this is really the how. Like I said, this is really the kind of fine tuning. And this actually, explicit instruction is a pedagogy that can be applied to any content area, but it is fundamental that it's applied to reading. So all of our elementary teachers have received professional learning on explicit instruction this year, and principals. 5 modules were created on the core components. And then because we have instructional coaches, which is an amazing thing to help improve Tier 1 instruction, the coaches had opportunities to provide feedback and support related to the implementation of explicit instruction. And that quote on the left really does summarize that fundamental idea that it is how well you teach. What you do or don't do is going to determine how well kids learn. That is a heavy thing to put on a teacher. That is hard. And it is incredibly important that we do everything we can systemically to make sure that they have what they need to do this very difficult job. So, explicit instruction at its core, it is focusing on teacher clarity. So Anita Archer, who is the foundation, she's the founding researcher. She is all things explicit instruction. She has all these great little Archerisms. They're like these sayings, but one of them is you teach the stuff and cut the fluff. You make sure that the only words coming out of your mouth are precise and judicious, and you are so clear about what it is that kids need to learn, that you leave no room for doubt. Along with that is this very intentional process to engage all learners. So again, Archer would say that for kind of low-level recall tasks, there should be 3 to 5 opportunities for kids to engage in learning per minute. Per minute. Now, that can take lots of different forms, but for a teacher, that means you stop asking questions that allow kids to raise hands. No hands in a classroom. Everything should be phrased in a way where all kids are asked to participate. They show whiteboards as a response, they turn and talk to their neighbor, they chorally respond, but it needs to be all kids engaged. And the kind of final tenet is that there are opportunities for student practice until mastery. So by the time that student gets to that independent practice, it is that teacher's way of assessing, did I present this information with such clarity that they can replicate this process without me being present? So that's at its core. And as I said, explicit instruction is actually relevant for any content area. It is, however, fundamentally necessary when we're talking about reading instruction. So it is the methodology necessary for kids to acquire those skills to become literate. Mr. Ranney's jumping back in.
Okay. I'm going to kind of briefly just go over the core components of explicit instruction. And it's really broken down into to 4 kind of content areas. And focusing on content and ensuring that in the planning process, the most critical content is identified by teachers as they're planning. And that gets at, I think we talked a lot about the behavior component earlier, and that's one of the things that we want to do. When kids are having a hard time attending, we have to be very intentional about what we're asking them to attend to. And so only putting the absolute most critical content in front of students is imperative. And then also chunking that learning so that we're giving kids digestible chunks of information, especially when it's new content, so that they can access the learning and it's not too much to take in at one time. And so then we move into the design process. And so that happens prior to the actual instruction of the lesson. And what we work through with teachers is making sure that the lessons that we're planning are clear and concise, because we want to limit the amount of extraneous things that we're kind of introducing, again, so that we're focusing on that most critical content, and that we have 3 really specific components to each lesson. Beyond when we launch the lesson and identify kind of the goal, we want to make sure that the teacher models through the use of an I do, that then they invite the students to complete to engage in the work together as a we do. So then they would be giving feedback, and then a you do would be when students eventually move into independence. And so that's all part of that planning process. We've developed a template for planning that is available to all teachers that kind of breaks down the explicit instruction lesson planning format. Again, so we want to develop some continuity across the district for all of our teachers and all of our learners. And Kirsten got a bit into the delivery, but really a huge thing that we focus on is opportunities to respond. So that is that 3 to 5 times per minute that we're inviting students to not just participate, but to actively engage in the learning. And that takes the form of a choral response. A lot of times in mathematics, we use whiteboards. Students may be writing a response. They may be having a conversation with a partner. It might be a small group conversation, but there's all these opportunities for students to actively engage in the learning. That also helps mitigate some of those behavioral or attention challenges that we have. The more lively the pace is, the less likely students are to kind of be off and have some of those down moments where the instruction flags a little is when we can see students become off task. It's super critical as well for teachers then, as students are producing those opportunities to respond, to monitor for accuracy. That's a critical component of explicit instruction. Is not that we're engaging, but we're engaging with high degrees of accuracy. That's how we move students forward. So part of that is the teacher actively listening or monitoring those responses, and then either providing affirmative feedback, so we've got it, we're going to move on, or more importantly, corrective feedback. We don't want students to be practicing inaccurately or practice the wrong thing. So we'll often, teachers will jump right in and say, nope, the way you would say that is, and then give the example so that we correct that, we provide that corrective feedback immediately. I mentioned the brisk pace earlier. That's a very important component. And then we move into the practice. And I think that's our biggest kind of next step across the board is providing judicious and spaced and independent practice. Sometimes it's hard to let go and give kids the opportunity to practice independently because we want to make sure the outcome is what we hope it to be. But that's super important, is that we give those opportunities to independently practice. And there are then further, within each of those content areas, elements of explicit instruction. And I touched on quite a few of them already, but the content's, it's critical, it's the most important, it's broken down. Within the design, we're organized and focused. Each lesson has a specific goal or a target. We review prior knowledge to kind of help onboard students to what they're going to be learning, and then we engage in that I do, we do, you do, otherwise known as a gradual release of responsibility. The delivery component, again, we're eliciting frequent responses, monitoring and providing feedback, and moving at a brisk pace, which I am modeling right now. Moving pretty quick here. And then the last one being that practice, and just that it's judicious and it's spaced, and that it's also cumulative in nature, so that kids, when they learn a skill, we need to come back and give them opportunities to continue to practice it so that it becomes more embedded in their cognitive framework.
Thank you. So, like a good explicit instruction lesson, this kind of wraps up this piece of it. And if you think about at the start, our learning targets were to introduce you or to help you become familiar with what are the causal factors that we focus on as a district, and also to review that district level data of NWEA so that you would be able to understand the many complex and dynamic factors that influence student learning. And if you were in a classroom, this would be your check. Do you feel like you have a clear sense of what are our next steps that we're taking at the elementary level to raise student achievement? So again, if I were a teacher, I might give you what's called an exit ticket and say, what would you identify as our next steps in raising student achievement? And that would be very much in keeping with an explicit instruction lesson, so that you're making sure that kids walk out with the most relevant, germane pieces of information. So that's our hope, that you were able to get from that part of the presentation. If you need some questions, we can certainly take those, or if you are ready to move on to the special ed piece of the evening, we can do that too. Good. All right.
This seems to be the model of the kid as an empty pitcher, and all you have to do is pour it in, and then you will get what you poured in return. It's an interesting model.
You're not going to get away with it. All right, good evening. So obviously Kirsten and her team did a fabulous job, and so we're here to talk to you tonight about special education and what it looks like for us. So along with me, I have Chelsea Grissinger. Chelsea is a resource room teacher at West Senior High, and Courtney Dedman is a resource teacher at Cherry Knoll. So they give two different perspectives, elementary and secondary. All right, so in your packet that you received, there are 13 different categories that students can qualify in for special education. So you'll see those 13 different categories and kind of a brief explanation. And then in the back of the packet, there are also what we call the MET reports. And basically that is your school psychologist, your speech therapist, whatever itinerant is on the team, and what they look at for qualification areas. And so it kind of just gives you just a little bit of background knowledge as we're thinking about how students are qualifying for special education. So you'll see here, this is the longitudinal data of students who qualify in our district by percentages. So you'll see the majority of our students are students who have otherwise health impaired. You'll see that's the red one at the third one down. That is one that we're noticing is increasing, and that is based on potentially a doctor's notification that a student might need some extra support. You'll also be able to see kind of where those trend lines kind of have steadied out over the years. You'll notice that purple line, the second one down, is our students who are qualifying for speech and language services. If we notice the dates, we can see a clear correlation potentially between COVID, the 2021 school year, and moving up. There's been an upward tick of those students who are qualifying for speech and language services. You'll also notice at the bottom, those are our less prevalent areas of need based on disability area. So our students with autism, our students with cognitive impairments, early childhood developmental delays, emotional impairments, deaf or hard of hearing, physical impairments, several multiple impairments, and then our visual impairments are listed at the bottom. So those are what we call our low incidence as compared to our specific learning disabilities, the speech and language, and otherwise health impaired. So that's kind of where we've been in terms of a trend line in terms of special education for our district. Right about 30% or so of our students are qualifying with a specific learning disability. So one of our main components of special education is a law. It's called the Least Restrictive Environment. And when we think about students who are needing support, we always are thinking, how are we going to keep them in their general education class and make sure that they're with their peers as much as possible? And so you'll see at the bottom is our blue classroom. It's just the regular run-of-the-mill classroom. It is what our teachers do on a daily basis. And for most of our kids, right, we're thinking roughly 95% of our students, they're right where they need to be. Unfortunately, there are some students who need some extra support. And so we're looking at that regular classroom with consultation. That could be maybe they just need a little bit of speech therapy, or maybe they only need a little occupational therapy, or physical therapy or social work services. They're just getting a little bit of that consultative model, and we move up the continuum to instructional services and supplemental instruction. And that is where our team starts to fill that void in terms of special education and resource room. And then up into the purple is where we're thinking, okay, we definitely need a special education teacher to help support our students and work towards goals and objectives that are outlined in their IEP. Then we look at separate classrooms. TCAPS only runs a few of those, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. Then you have your separate schools. Northwest Ed is our colleagues that run our separate schools for the region. We have the Bridgeway program, which services students with autism or characteristics of autism. We also have our Creekside for our students with significant emotional impairments, and then we have Horizons for our students with several multiple impairments. Obviously, there's residential schools. The biggest one in the state of Michigan is for our students who are deaf or hard of hearing. That's down in Flint. It's a residential school for students who need additional support beyond the traditional classroom or what we call TC services, teacher consultant services for the deaf or hard of hearing. And then obviously we do have some students who are homebound or hospitalized. A lot of our students do come into the district, and because of medical needs, their physician has said there's absolutely no reason for the student to be in school due to a significant health concern. So we do have students who are getting some of those services as well. But our goal in special education and the letter of the law is that we have to be thinking about how can we keep our kids as much as we can in those red, green, and blue areas before we move up that continuum. Because the further we move up the continuum, the less likely they are to have general education peers. And our goal is always to keep them with their peers. We know that students learn by watching others. This is when peer pressure, we are really grateful for it because they are modeling some of those really good things that their peers are. When I think about a student who maybe has a speech deficit, right? When they are hearing other students talking, they're picking up on those things, which is really imperative for them. So we always are thinking about least restrictive in terms of a student's IEP. Questions on least restrictive? Probably the most important thing. We're anticipating a potential audit through the state of Michigan. We don't know if we're going to be one of 10 districts that are picked throughout the region or throughout the state, but that is one that we will find out in June whether we are selected to go through an LRE audit through the state of Michigan. Questions about least restrictive?
Question.
Yeah.
Do we still have the School for the Blind in Lansing?
As far as I know, we do not. There was one in Ohio, but I don't believe we do.
Okay, because Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, no, it's been
I
closed
thought.
for quite a while. It's
Quite a-
actually
quite
been
a few
completely
years.
remodeled, yeah. It's been closed for about 25 years.
Yeah. There's
Which
one.
means that there's not as much need?
I don't know about that. I
Hopefully.
think it's just that they didn't have the resources and those things to do. Even the Michigan School for the Deaf was in quite disrepair till it was bought and a smaller one built for them. So,
And again, when we're thinking about students with visual impairments, we're thinking, what would it impact them so much that they would need to go to a segregated facility as opposed to being with their peers as much as possible? How can we support them in their general education environment as much as possible? So our goal in special education is thinking that special education is not a place. It is a continuation of supports and services throughout an IEP. So you're thinking, okay, what kind of consult services can be supported? How can we adapt the curriculum? What are the teams that can come together to support this student? How do we give them physical assistance? It's not a place. It's so important to recognize that special education is not the kids will go over here, right? When we think about in Kate and Kirk's building, there's not a place that we just send students, right? They are part of the general ed population as much as possible so that they can have good peer models and they can have what we consider that least restrictive environment. So we're really proud that when we think about general education and students with IEPs, our goal is to always have them in their general ed environment 80% of the time or more with their gen ed peers. And I can honestly say that we are out performing the state in that area as well as North Ed. There are probably a lot of different reasons for that, but our goal is to keep our kids with their general ed peers as much as possible. So we will talk about early childhood programs here in TCAPS. The first one is what we call standalone services. So that might be a student who just qualifies for speech therapy, or maybe they just need some occupational therapy. They would qualify for the service. This parent would bring them into their local building. They would get some service minutes, and then they're taken home. There's no classroom environment. It is simply them working with one-to-one primarily with a service provider to work on their IEP goals and objectives. So that's the first one. That's what we would consider the least restrictive. They're not in a classroom setting, but they're getting their needs met through those itinerant services. The next one is what we call 1755 services, and you might be asking yourself, well, how did she come up with the word 1755? It's actually the letter of the law. All laws in special education, you'll see the big binder there on my desk, and that is the laws that we have to follow in the world of special education. And so 1755 is really those students who just are maybe in a GSRP classroom, that Great Start Readiness Program, or a Head Start classroom that's operated in our district. And we push in a special education teacher who's certified in early childhood, and they support those students up to 72 hours for a calendar year. So you can see that that's very minimal support. We back out any services such as OT, PT, social work. So for some of those kids, they're getting very little special education resource room support. Most of their support's coming from itinerants. The next on the continuum, so again, moving up to that more supportive, is what we call 1755 co-teaching. And currently we're doing that in GSRP as well as our Head Start classrooms. And that is truly the co-teaching experience. For example, if I was the gen ed teacher and Chelsea was the special education teacher, we would co-teach that GSRP or Head Start classroom together to support our students. We have roughly 4 to 5 students who have IEPs along with the rest of the classroom, which is 11 other students who don't have an area of need. And so it is really a great opportunity for those young ones to have interaction with peers who are more typical. And then the last classroom that we offer here in TCAPS is what we call our early childhood special education classroom. And that is a self-contained program for students ages 3 to 5. It is the most supported classroom. It is taught by a special education teacher who's certified in early childhood. And then we also have 2 assistants in that classroom. So students might be in there who qualify with areas of need that are more broad strokes. So they might qualify for speech, OT, maybe some cognitive needs, but they're the ones who need our most support. And those run currently, we have a morning section and an afternoon section, roughly 3 hours. And so it's a great opportunity for those students 4 days a week to get as much support as possible to get them ready for kindergarten. And so that's a great opportunity for our kids. In terms of curriculum for our early childhood special ed classrooms, we use Creative Curriculum, which is actually what all of our tuition-based as well as GSRP Head Start classrooms utilize. We just modify it as needed. We slow things down a little bit, and we work with our students. And then they are assessed using our GOLD curriculum, just like our tuition-based as well as GSRP and Head Start. So any questions on early childhood? They are fun classrooms to get into.
Could you go back one slide really
Yeah,
quick? Or
absolutely.
the one that you just
This
had?
one?
The one that was
This
there.
one?
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yep. So it's a great opportunity for our kids to be included as much as possible when you think about that least restrictive and most supported. So I'm going to turn it over to Courtney, who's going to talk to you about elementary.
So the first program that students could qualify for would be standalone services. And again, those are services like just a student who might need speech and language or occupational therapy. They don't need necessarily the academic support, it's just those other supports that they need. Then we go into resource room, and that's where the academics is playing a part. So if they qualify and they have difficulties in reading, writing, or math, then they would get pulled in those certain subject areas to receive explicit direct instruction in those areas above and beyond what they're being taught within the classroom. So they get the direct instruction from their teacher in the general education setting, and then they get pulled to the resource room for direct instruction more of where at their level, whether they're math and they're a couple of grades behind, then I would provide instruction at their level to kind of close that gap. So they're not missing what's in class, they're still learning that as I would be teaching the other stuff for them to catch up. The MyKai classroom is for students grade 3 through 5. Sometimes it goes to 6 in the elementary. And this is for students who would be on essential elements. So these are not the same standards that the students in the general education curriculum are on. They are a different set of standards, and the majority of the time, there are some exceptions to the rule, but the majority of the time these students are working towards a certificate of completion and not necessarily a diploma. So their IQ is typically lower, so they use a different program, and that's what that is. Any questions on those? So these are the curriculums that are currently being used. So for math, we have a program called Connecting Math Concepts. We have Delta Math and Number Worlds. Connecting Math Concepts is a very language-based program, and it really spirals in what is being taught. So each lesson covers multiple items, and the next lesson continues those items, covers those items again. So it just kind of keeps spiraling. The Delta Math is very standards-based, so it really focuses on one standard where the student has a deficit and works for them to get mastery in that area. Number Worlds is a program typically used for our younger students that has a lot of manipulatives and is extremely repetitive with what that teaches with just basic number concepts. For language arts, we have rewards, phonics for reading, early reading tutor, corrective reading for comprehension and decoding. So we really have a wide variety based on where students need that support. If they, if they really just need that phonics support, we can provide something like phonics for reading or early reading tutor. If we know that they're in that comprehension phase and that's where they really need the support, we can do the corrective reading comprehension. For writing, right now, we have expressive writing and SRSD. So expressive writing is, again, a very language-based program that students work through. And then SRSD is what the gen ed teachers are using, again, as a strategy to help those students perform. We kind of reiterate that within the resource room and define it a little bit more for our kids or slow it down a little bit for them. In the mild cognitively impaired classroom, they use the unique curriculum along with reading mastery for kindergarten and first grade and connecting math concepts, the lower levels A and B. Any questions on those?
Chelsea.
Okay, now we finally get to talk about the big kids. So, some of this will be a little redundant, but with the standalone services, hold on, I don't want to get yelled at. So students are with their gen ed peers for primarily the whole day, and then they have itinerant services who come in to support them. Co-taught classes are when you have two teachers, right, who are in the classroom supporting all of the gen ed and special ed students. Department is when you have a self-contained classroom for a subject specific. So like I'm an English teacher, I can do a department English class. I have like 10 kids in my class. The PASS program, which is at West Senior High only, those are my babies. They are certificate of completion. They're not babies. They would hate if I said that. They are like 16, 17, and 18, but they'll always be called my babies. I'm with them 2 to 3 hours a day. And then the MyKai classroom, which again is the mild cognitive impairments, those students are 9 through 12 over at Central.
In
Oh,
one
is that
note,
me?
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, we're the only district in our ISD that runs those programs.
That is correct. Yes, all other districts in the region do not offer MyKai classrooms, and we offer those grades 3 all the way through 12.
Which the PASS program is also pretty specific to our district, which my kiddos are certificate of completion. But with that being said, like I know sometimes we think that that's a limiting thing, but my kids also can be served till 26. They also in the afternoon can go to CTC. They can go on work experience, right? There's other services that are available to them because they are in my classroom. And they're with their gen ed peers when they're not with me. So like right now I have one kid that goes to CTC, one kid who works all afternoon, a couple kids who are in art, gym, right? So like they still have opportunities that their peers have, but when they're with me, they get functional math, functional English, curriculum that is actually accessible to them and that they need after high school because it is core. It's not the core curriculum, it is essential elements. So it's more like budgeting, shopping, what do they need to be successful humans once they leave me? So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just want to ask the mildly.
Yes, I'll go back.
MyKai?
Yeah,
Yes.
MyKai. That's just certain buildings, right?
Yes. So, so the MyKai classroom is at Central. It's housed there. There is a Northwest Ed run one at
We
West.
transport them there from
Yes.
all over our district.
To Central High School.
Yes.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So
And there's a
it's
slide on that in a minute.
Central, East Central.
That one is.
Yeah. So then there is a quote there from Marilyn Friend. Marilyn Friend, if you guys don't know, this is like the guru of co-teaching, and we've been fortunate enough to work with her for the past 2 years at TCAPS. She's done a lot of training with us. We have her book, actually 2 consecutive years of books from her, and we've been working with her to really hone in on co-teaching and make co-teaching so it is, I guess, more effective in the way that we are keeping teachers together who work well together, who can really support both our gen ed and special ed students. And so co-teaching has been a top priority for our district. So right now for the secondary for math, in my program we use Generation Genius and Real World Math, both again, which are functional, right? So what do you need to know to be a person who can go out in society and be independent? And then the co-taught classes are using college preparatory math, CPM. And then English, we are currently using in middle school and high school, My Perspectives, which is essentially a collective of units that all have a theme, right? That all the stories follow, and the writing that is also embedded in that. It's all within themes. And then Readtopia is what my past program also uses, which is more, it's like a 5th, 6th grade level for my high school students, so that it's more at their level and, really cool stories that they can learn lessons from. And then the writing, we don't have anything specific to writing right now at the secondary level. It is embedded in the Perspectives curriculum. So essentially, like at the end of each story, right, there's questions about the story that they have to answer, and then at the end there is a paper that ties all of them in. So if the whole unit was on survival, the paper at the end would be about survival, and they have to then use the stories to write their paper on, right, and embed that information. Okay. The mildly cognitively impaired, so just what you were asking about, the MyKai program at Central. So these students do have 4 to 5 hours of direct instruction, right? It is more self-contained and more support. Again, that curriculum is very repetitive. It's slower paced. These students are working towards essential elements because they are, again, on the certificate of completion track, right? So different trajectory for them. The curriculum that they are currently using is Unique Curriculum, Scholastic News, Readtopia, and then a life skills unit, really hitting on those life skills that they need to be independent. In addition to that, Central does a peer-to-peer program where they have students who are general education students who come into the program to work with the students because they are in that room, right, the most of their days, so that gives them the opportunity to still interact with their peers.
So the next thing we just wanted to talk to you about is the pilots that are currently going on. I know I talked to you all a little bit during our last board meeting, but we do have some pretty great things going on in terms of pilots in special education. So I'll have Courtney talk about the math pilot.
So Bridges is the program, and it is a very coherent program. It relates well to what the students are learning in the class as well. The vocabulary is very well aligned to that. Not only is it fluency, it's got the problem solving, story problems, and with its placement tests, it really shows where the students where they land and exactly what to focus on, which also helps with their IEP goals and objectives in making sure that we're hitting those and making progress in those areas. There's a lot of visuals, there's a lot of manipulatives, which obviously are great for students who need extra support, so that is also another benefit of the Bridges program. In this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Step Up to Writing is another pilot with not really having tons of writing options. This program is really great because it does closely align with the SRSD, in which the students are learning in their general education curriculum, or in their general education class. There's a ton of visuals, there's lots of practice for these students, very repetitive. There's a lot of different ways for students to show their writing in different ways. So it's great for elementary.
Yeah, and at the high school level, I think the important thing, as I said earlier, we don't really have a explicit writing program that we're using right now. Since it is embedded in my perspectives, it gives you like the assignment and the rubric, but there's no explicit direction to teach the students how to write those papers. So a lot of that is then teacher driven, right? Then we create what we need to then teach the students with, whereas this is that, right? That's what we as teachers have been developing on our own. It has models, it has like highlighted paragraphs that show what a well-written paragraph looks like, what one needs that needs work, right? So there's a lot of that explicit instruction that is within this that we don't necessarily have right now to help our students learn how do I write, right? Instead of just like write this paper, it's like how do I embed evidence? How do I do an introduction? How do I do a works cited page, right? So these things that they need to do at a very systematic approach.
And I think what's important to talk about too is when we think about the bridges in the math or in the writing program is we have had quite a few teachers looking at the programs. I believe we had 6 teachers piloting the bridges mathematics, and the reviews have been great thus far. They've really enjoyed it. Step Up to Writing, we had how many? 5, 6 of us? I think there were 5 or 6 K-12. And so we really were able to look, and we had a trial period, and we were given all the information. And so the teachers are currently using it through the end of the year to hopefully we'll get some good results and be able to work through that.
Another thing with both of those, because they're going to jump in and talk about the STAR, is there is progress monitoring within the Bridges math program, which is really nice, so then we can stop and evaluate how the students are doing, if they're making progress, or if we need to go back and reteach or switch lanes. So it's those programs both have that built in within the lessons, which is really nice to be able to keep track of that data as well.
And the last thing is the STAR Renaissance. We've initiated that 9 through 12. We did a soft pilot at the middle school level. However, the teams felt like they wanted to use AimsWeb at more than the STAR Renaissance. So we have implemented it 9-12, and it's a great opportunity to look at reading as well as math. Part of the letter of the law does say we have to progress monitor, and so this gives our secondary folks an opportunity to use computer-based information for their students and their IEPs. I would also just like to note that the MyKai, like I said, goes 3 through 12. We do have the MyKai program also over at East Middle School. Currently, they service our students who are in grades 7 and 8. That's sometimes kind of a revolving door in terms of if it's going to be 6, 8, or just 7, 8 based on numbers. So that's something we look at each fall. So we went through a lot. It's 8:01. I'm trying to be cognizant of time. So my question, do you have any questions in terms of special education, anything that we're doing as a team? I would just say that I get to work with 55 incredible special education teachers across this district, and we service just over 1,000 students, and it's pretty incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Please don't take our, yeah. Definitely think there would be plenty of questions too, with allowing for time, but we want to be cognizant of everyone's availability as well. Is there any over-desiring anything here as well? Okay. Well, thank you so much for the awesome information. It's definitely a lot to take in, and we'll do this a couple more times with different levels as well. With that, we'll move on to public comment. Do we have any public comment? Oh, all right. Bill, you have set aside this time for public comment. Individuals addressing the board should have one opportunity to speak, limited to 3 minutes. Individuals should not make personal attacks unrelated to actions affecting the school system. We strongly encourage common courtesy and constructive feedback. Detailed rules and procedures, including a complaint process, are outlined in Board Policy 0167.3.
Bill Wiesner, Traverse City, and didn't know what was going to be talked about tonight, but I was going to just talk about this book anyway, and it seems to be hitting on the topic here. Again, I mentioned we give away these DVDs, It's a big difference on your worldview. Looks at an old Earth or a global flood, goes over the Grand Canyon, and there's a whole lot of evidence for a global flood, thousands of years, not 60,000 years back to language, 5,000 to writing. Everything goes back about 6,000 years. But I'll give these away if you like one. This book is Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. It's Government, Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, and How to Stop It. It's by Alex Newman. I hope everyone here gets a copy because it's certainly relevant to what's going on in the schools today. And specifically, there's a chapter on what was discussed tonight. I forgot to set this, so just let me know when my time's up. On chapter 5 is entitled Socialists Use Public Schools to Destroy Literacy in America. So it's on page. I move my marker. I haven't read this until just during the meeting, but page 24. Yeah. It goes into literacy crisis. It goes back to the founding of our nation and looking, the kids, they say, learned to read basically at home. And they had 2 books taught reading using phonics, the New England Primer and Blueback Speller. And they did quite fine with the Federalist Papers and things like that. And then it's got a section here called Quackery Pushed by Collectivists. And he talks about this one guy, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Galladay, maybe? He sounds like French. And he had a whole word looking for teaching, and it worked excellent with deaf people. But then he thought maybe it would work excellent for other people. And, but it doesn't, it didn't. Actually, when I went to MSU, I did take, and I don't remember any of it, but 3 terms of teaching reading. So, and that was whole word at MSU. And I don't think it helped me that much. But, so resurrecting the quackery.
Mr. Wiesner, your time is up.
Okay, please read this book.
Is there any additional public comment? All right. Moving on that, just board president closing remarks. Appreciate the understanding. Recently, I've dealt with a number of family matters. I would like to say that I'm through all those changes in my life, but I know that that's obviously not the case. So they will continue to come. So thank you for the patience. I am behind to the public on, especially with the communications issues we've had at TCAPS. I am behind on a number of emails and physical mail as well, but I will be catching up over the next week or so. One of those items that I did want to bring up is a communication that John is planning on sending out to staff. It's kind of a complicated set of factors with some board policies, may require notice to the board. So I did want to make sure you had that, and it is in your email. I do not need a motion, but certainly want to make sure that no one objects to John and I's line of thinking. Please reach out with any questions if you do. With that, is there any questions at all on that? And I move to, or does anyone, I can't move, but does someone move to adjourn the meeting?
I move.
Move?
Second.
There you go.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Meeting adjourned.